This July 27th marks the 60th anniversary of the Armistice Agreement that put an end to fighting in the Korean War. But as we all know, it did not put an end to the hostilities and tensions on the Korean Peninsula. So where do we go from here? For insights, we are joined this week by Kim Tae-woo, former president of the Korea Institute for National Unification. On July 27, 1953, the 37-month-long war on the Korean Peninsula came to a halt. 3 years after North Korean troops started the war by launching an invasion across the 38th parallel into Seoul, an armistice agreement put a ceasefire into effect. To end the protracted war, the UN Command, People's Volunteer Army, and Korean People's Army began armistice negotiations in 1951. After 2 years of grueling negotiations over the demilitarized zone, the military demarcation line, prisoners of war, and other truce-related issues, the armistice agreement was made on July 27, 1953. A 250-kilometer-long Korean demilitarized zone was created, dividing the Korean Peninsula at the 38th parallel. Despite having the word demilitarized in its title, the DMZ is a hotbed of military tension between South and North Korea. Korea has technically remained at war for the last 60 years. Mr. Kim Tae-woo, thank you very much for being on the show. Now, July 27th, the 60th anniversary since the Korean War ostensibly came to an end. Being an expert on issues related to the peninsula, what are your thoughts during a time like this?
Well, it was a really horrendous war, recording 6 million military and civilian casualties, and in which, the unknown soldiers from 16 countries also fought, So as a South Korean citizen, I think, should think, of course, first of all, the real meaning of Korean War as a war that defended democracy and freedom. So I think as a specialist in defense and unification area, we should think about real meaning of war. And also we should appreciate contribution made by those heroes and also the foreign heroes. But unfortunately, we have very sad and heart-wrenching stories around us. For example, the history of Korean War is intentionally distorted by some school teachers, and also many of those who died during the war are not buried in the national cemeteries. So there are many, sad stories. So that kind of things is just come to my mind, when I think about the armistice.
And the Cold War, long over now, yet the Korean Peninsula remains divided. Technically, the two Koreas are still at war to this day. What significance does that hold for the Korean people? Explain that a little bit for us.
Yes, you are right. Armistice is not a permanent peace system. This is simply a temporary suspension of hostilities. But the simple absence of all-out war during the last 60 years simply makes Korean people forget about what happened, and also forget about difference between armistice and real peace, But nevertheless, we have experienced a lot of sufferings and difficulties under the divided system. We have a separated family problem here, and also we have numerous North Korean military provocations, from the 50s until now. So I think that a grave task, the challenges now is when and how we can change this armistice system into a permanent peace system. When and how we can change the clumsy, temporary, and very fragile peace into a permanent one. So that's kind of a challenge imposed upon us.
Let's talk about the armistice agreement itself. Hindsight, of course, being 2020. We've had now 60 years to reflect on the agreement, and we've seen what's happened during that time period. Looking at the armistice agreement, with that perspective, are there any changes, alterations, adjustments when you look at it, that could have been made at the time that would have maybe worked a bit better over the past 60 years?
I don't see many of them, like that, So why don't we take a look at, briefly the history of the war? As you know, the war started by North Korean invasion, and they occupied Seoul just in 3 days, and in 2 months they occupied all of the South Korea, except just a little part in the southeastern area, And then in September in the same year, 1950. The landing operation by United Nations, turned the tide of war, and then this invited the Chinese intervention. So this is the stories. Well, I think for South Korea there was no other choice. Even though South Korean government, particularly President Lee Seung-man, strongly opposed the armistice negotiation. Because he wanted to unify the Korea, but South Korea was not capable of doing that, totally depending on the U.S. The military forces. And the U.S. already by that time had lost many lives already. So Washington was in extreme war fatigue. So beginning of the negotiation maybe was the inevitable choice. But ironically, even since then, South Korea made a miraculous economic success and now becoming one of the economic powers in the world, while North Korea has become one of the poorest countries in the world.
Yeah, the transition, of course, is it's a stark contrast.
Yeah.
Contrast for sure. You mentioned earlier about the distortions about the Korean War. North Korea looks at the Korean War on July 27th,
right,
and they call it "quote unquote" Victory Day. Explain a little bit about why that is.
They call it a day of victory in the National Liberation War. And also the victory that's their own version, their own interpretation of Korean War. They have reasons why they call it that way. Internally, they have to justify the Korean War that invited a widespread devastation in North Korea, and also they have to continue to idolize this great leader, in order to strengthen their, the political basis. So that's why they have reasons to celebrate the war as a victory, a victorious war. And externally, the victory means, not only for North Korea but also for China. China at that time tried to contain, the American influence and then participated in the war. So the victory is kind of the catalyst, the cementing the alliance between North Korea and China. So that's why they call it that way.
Right. And as people are apt to do during celebrations, there will be celebrations going on July 27th in North Korea. Military parades are going to be showing off military hardware. They've invited foreign journalists to come in and look on the festivities. What is sort of their motive behind all of the pomp and circumstance that we're seeing?
I think North Korea is struggling to get out of difficulties that surround that country. We know that North Korea continued the nuclear weapon development, and North Korea conducted a third nuclear test in early this year. And then it invited the resentment of international community, even the anger of China. So that's why North Korea want to get out of this image. That's why North Korea is spending a lot of money, and then North Korea can spew out a lot of beautiful, stories toward the invited foreign press. But I will not be impressed, because for too long we have witnessed the drastic difference between what they say and what they do.
China, of course, will be watching the events of July 27th as well.
Yeah.
How do you think that they are viewing the celebrations in the North?
Well, traditionally, China has participated in North Korea's celebration of Victory Day, and also the celebration of China-North Korea Alliance Treaty Day. Traditionally, they did that, But frankly speaking, I feel some temperature difference between Pyongyang and Beijing, Even though we can feel some excitement in Beijing, in Pyongyang, but we don't see that excitement in Beijing. Probably China is very much precautious not to give a wrong message to North Korea, Even though China is the only ally to North Korea, supporting the political survival of North Korean regime, but China has many other reasons to cooperate with the international community over North Korea's nuclear matters and peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula.
Getting back to the armistice agreement, North Korea back in March said it was scrapping the 1953 agreement. This is something they've done on numerous occasions in the past, as recently as 2009 before this. Given the wording of the armistice and the way it's laid out, is that even possible, this idea of scrapping it? Is that a possibility?
Negative.
Negative. So no.
Well, the armistice agreement cannot be scrapped or abrogated unilaterally. When we look at Article 5 of that agreement, that very clearly stipulates that any revision or supplement should be made through an agreement of the concerned party. And also, it also stipulates that this agreement is valid until it is replaced by another, which is also done by a agreement among the concerned parties. So legally, it's not possible. And also, we know that North Korea talked about the scrapping the armistice agreement as a propaganda, as a tension heightening, tactics, So I don't think we need to place any legal significance on that remarks.
North Korea has broken the armistice, though, on numerous occasions, as recently as 2010 with the two attacks on two South Korean targets. Yeah. Some would argue that the agreement at this point is merely symbolic. Others might say it's invalid now. Is there any validity to those arguments? Yeah,
they are right. They are right. We know, we remember numerous provocations committed by North Korea. In the 60s, they sent even commando troops to kill South Korean president. And also they sent the armed guerrillas. And then they enjoyed the really promiscuous killings against the civilians and children. And in the 70s, they killed the American officers in the joint security areas. And everybody knows that. So there, the provocation continues, 80s, 90s, even after 2000, As you already mentioned about the sinking of our corvette warship, Cheonan, and also the shelling on our island, Yeonpyeong Island, So he's right. As long as North Korea continues the military provocation, and as long as North Korea continues to harbor very subversive South Korea policies, yes, the agreement is just symbolic rather than substantial. But what I want to say at this moment is still it is better than nothing.
Right. We've got a front row seat on sort of this roller coaster that is inter-Korean relations here, of course. Earlier in the year, the tensions ratcheted up, and now they seem to be calming down a little bit. In June, North Korea basically called for replacing the armistice agreement with a full-on, complete peace treaty with the United States. What are your thoughts on that?
Peace treaty argument, that's a really, really beautiful argument, This is a necessity, and the justifiability is undeniable, irrefutable, But the problem is the way to a real a peace treaty, the road leading to real peace treaty, will be very long and bumpy and ambushed by a lot of dangers and traps.
Well, it's the intention behind
yes,
the offer, right?
Yes, of course. The key problem is the sincerity of North Korea. What did they have in mind when they suggested the peace treaty? Well, for North Korea, the ROC-U.S. alliance and the presence of U.S. forces is the major stumbling blocks against its own South Korea policies. So they have long tried to eliminate influence of United States over Korean Peninsula. So we know that they are arguing for a peace treaty, but their purpose is how to eliminate the U.S. influence from the Korean Peninsula. So as long as this situation continues, I don't think we will be ready to sit down for negotiating a peace treaty.
Starting this year, the South Korean government is going to be observing July 27th as a memorial day for Korean War veterans who were under the UN command. What is the significance in the change in the way that July 27th will be observed here in South Korea?
We should have done that earlier. Well, during the Korean War, some 2 million foreign soldiers fought here, mostly Americans. But then we still have 500,000 survivors. So this is really natural for South Korea to recognize their contribution. So that's why the government, the action may be too late. But I think this is very good. South Korea as well as the international community to reconfirm the real meaning of the Korean War as a war that safeguarded the democracy and freedom. So it's good, but it's too late. Yeah.
And in Washington, D.C., at the Korean War Veterans Memorial, they will have a ceremony, of course. U.S. President Barack Obama is going to speak at that ceremony, the first U.S. president to do so. That speaks volumes as well, does it not?
Yeah, the same story is going there, I really welcome it. As is the case in South Korea, for many the Americans, I think it is also very sad and bitter to watch the shrinking number of surviving Korean War veterans. And also, they really hate to see Korean War is now being forgotten by many Americans. The same situation is happening in South Korea. In that sense, for the first time, United States, the president participate to speak at that ceremony. It is very meaningful. So I think it is a really good opportunity for both countries, South Korea and United States, to reconfirm the real meaning of the Korean War and reanimate and remember the contributions they made.
During President Park's recent trip to China, she offered to return the remains of hundreds of Chinese soldiers who fought alongside the North, of course, during the Korean War. Quite a gesture. What do you make of that offer there?
I think this is a very good reconciliation gesture that now South Korean government is making. During the Korean War, about 2.5 million Chinese soldiers participated in the war. So at that time, the whole the size of a whole PLA, People's Liberation Army, was 4.5 million, something like that. That means China projected more than half of their military forces in the Korean Peninsula. Among them, 150,000 died in this land. So there are so many dead bodies over here and there on the Korean Peninsula. But time changed. Now China is a very important neighbor to South Korea. Last year, our trade volume with China amounted to $220 billion. Exchange of visit between two countries amounted to 7 million. So now South Korean government is placing top priority to both maintaining the alliance with the United States and to maintaining unhostile, friendly relations with China. That's critically important to our prosperity and survival. So in that sense, President Park Geun-hye's suggestion is very natural. Very natural, I welcome it, yeah.
Looking at the landscape as it is now, what are the remaining challenges that are going to be facing the Park Geun-hye administration in the year or months and years to come, I should say?
Well, microscopic analysis first. North Korea has two faces. The face of sisters and brothers on the one hand, but on the other hand, North Korea is also our enemy. So that's why we have to exercise principle and flexibility, both. When we deter or when we defeat North Korea's the military provocations or security threat, we have to exercise principle, very firm principle. But when North Korea come to us with open mind, then we have to exercise flexibility and we have to exercise our generosity for dialogue and cooperation. This is what we should do, The Park Geun-hye government is no exception, So whatever government in Seoul, I think this position is unchangeable. But when we open up our eyes a little bit wider, we can easily see the Korean government is now surrounded by many disadvantageous development. The rise of China, this is giving us both opportunities as well as challenges, and also the increasingly vehement competition between China and the United States, So this is giving another momentum to the China-North Korea alliance, So this is one of the reasons why North Korea is increasingly recalcitrant these days, And also there is a big conservative swing in Japan. Japan is now claiming territorial, issues, and also the despicable denying its past history. So this kind of situation actually destroyed the Korea-U.S.-Japan trilateral collaboration in this area. Well, internally, we still have many economic issues and problems, and we have also in North Korea sympathizers. Very active sympathizers, North Korea sympathizers. Some of them are members in national assemblies. Some others are teachers in school. All these challenges, this is what Park Geun-hye government should grapple with.
Certainly a lot of variables, a lot of challenges ahead. We appreciate you being here on the show today, Mr. Kim Tae-woo, to provide your insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.